He sat in the living room trying to read. He made himself a whiskey and soda at his small bar, and he held the cold glass as he read a physiology text. From the speaker over the hallway door, the music of Schoenberg was playing loudly. Not loudly enough, though. He still heard them outside, their murmurings and their walkings about and their cries, their snarling and fighting amongst themselves. Once in a while, a rock or brick thudded off the house. Sometimes a dog barked. And they were all there for the same thing. Robert Neville closed his eyes a moment and held his lips in a tight line. Then he opened his eyes and lit another cigarette, letting the smoke go deep into his lungs. He wished he'd had time to soundproof the house. It wouldn't be so bad if it weren't that he had to listen to them. Even after 5 months, it still got on his nerves. He never looked at them anymore. In the beginning, he'd made a peephole in the front window and watched them. But then the women had seen him, and he started striking vile postures in order to entice them out of the house. He didn't want to look at that. He put down his book and started bleakly at the rug, listening to Verlaert Nacht play over the loudspeaker. He knew he could put plugs in his ears to shut off the sound of them, but that would shut off the music too, and he didn't want to feel that they were forcing him into a shell. He closed his eyes again. It was like the women who made it so difficult, he thought. The women posing like lewd puppets in the night on the possibility that he'd see them and decide to come out. A shudder ran through him. Every night it was the same. He'd be reading and listening to music. Then he'd start and think about soundproofing the house. Then he'd think about the women. Deep in his body, the nodding heat began again, and he pressed his lips together until they were white. He knew the feeling well, and it enraged him that he couldn't combat it. It grew and grew until he couldn't sit still anymore. Then he'd get up and pace the floor, fists bloodless at his sides. Maybe he'd set up the movie projector or eat something, or have too much to drink, or turn up the music so loud it hurt his ears. He had to do something when it got really bad. He felt the muscles of his abdomen closing in like tightening coils. He picked up the book and tried to read, his lips forming each word slowly and painfully. But in a moment the book was on his lap again. He looked at the bookcase across from him. All the knowledge in those books couldn't put out the fires in him. All the words of centuries couldn't end the wordless, mindless craving of his flesh. The realization made him sick. It was an insult to a man. All right, it was a natural drive, but there was no outlet for it anymore. They'd forced celibacy on him. He'd have to live with it. You have a mind, don't you? He asked himself. Well, use it. He reached over and turned the music still louder, then forced himself to read a whole page without pause. He read about blood cells being forced through membranes, about pale lymph carrying the waste through tubes blocked by lymph nodes, about lymphocytes and phagocytic cells, to empty in the left shoulder region near the thorax into a large vein of blood circulating system. The book shut with a thud. Why didn't they leave him alone? Why did they think that they could all have him? Were they so stupid they thought that? Why did they keep coming every night? After 5 months you'd think they'd give up and try somewhere else. He went over to the bar and made himself another drink. As he turned back to his chair, he heard stones rattling down across the roof and landing with thuds in the shrubbery behind the house. Above the noises, he heard Ben Cortman shout, as he always shouted, "Come out, Neville." Someday I'll get that bastard, he thought, as he took a big swallow of the bitter drink. Someday I'll knock a stake right through his goddamn chest. I'll make one a foot long for him, a special one with ribbons on it, the bastard. Tomorrow he'd soundproof the house. His fingers drew into white-knuckled fists. He couldn't stand thinking about those women. If he didn't hear them, maybe he wouldn't think about them. Tomorrow. The music ended and he took a stack of records off the turntable and slid them back into the cardboard envelopes. Now he could hear them even more clearly outside. He reached for the first new record he could get and put it on the turntable and listened to the volume up to its highest point. The Year of the Plague by Robert Lee filled his ears. Violins scraped and whined, timpani thudded like the beats of a dying heart, flutes played weird, atonal melodies. With a stiffening of rage, he'd wrenched up the record and snapped it over his right knee. He had meant to break it long ago. He walked on rigid legs to the kitchen and flung the pieces into the trash can. Then he stood in the dark kitchen, eyes tightly shut, teeth clenched, hands clamped over his ears. "Leave me alone! Leave me alone! Leave me alone!"